Hi, I'm Sean Mooney, Professor and Chief Research Information Officer of UW Medicine at the University of Washington. Over the past year, the University of Washington has been advancing an initiative in medical data science, and as part of that, we've developed a seminar to bring thought leaders together in the field of artificial intelligence and data science to advance patient care and improve provider satisfaction. Every 2 weeks, we will be releasing new videos from these seminars on this YouTube channel. We hope you enjoy this series. Please be sure to register for our mailing list using the link below to be alerted when new talks become available. Thank you.
So I've been working in this space since the early 80s, but it really feels like we are now at the dawn of a new era of data in healthcare. There's long been an interest in using data optimally in healthcare, but there have been a number of barriers to achieving this goal, which are starting to break down currently. I believe we're at an inflection point in terms of the availability and potential use of data. Previously, there was a limited amount of computable data available on patients. That is increasing dramatically over time as more and more places move to electronic medical records. The ease of accessing that data increases as we move to more consolidated medical record environments, such as the move at the UW to move from two different EHRs to a single electronic health record, also known as the Destination One or D1 project, which is going live in January. Nationally, there has been more and more efforts to share data across institutions, creating even larger data sets that can be used for machine learning, for data science, and for other applications that are difficult to do at a single institution. The Clinical Translational Science Award Centers have been doing this slowly over the last decade, and the COVID pandemic provided a major incentive to begin to share cross-institutional data as well. And nationally, there's more and more pressure to figure out how to optimally leverage these healthcare data assets. Unfortunately, Paul Ramsey was at the last minute unable to join us today, but will be giving a address on his perspective on these things as an introduction to one of the lectures later in the quarter. But he's articulated it very elegantly as informatics is the central and peripheral nervous system of UW medicine. The peripheral nervous system being the gathering of data from disparate sources, from process measure data to patient reported data to data from patient devices to genomic data to the data from the medical record. And then the concept here of the central nervous system is using tools like data science, artificial intelligence, and other ways of manipulating and making sense out of all of this data to continue to improve our care. The division that I chair, Biomedical Informatics and Medical Education, has, for the Division of Biomedical Informatics, the vision of unleashing the potential for electronic biomedical information to improve health, aligned with the broader UW Medicine mission of improving health. Next slide. So I titled this The Promise and the Peril. For 40 years, I've been intrigued by the promise and have continually seen myself and others tripped up by aspects of the peril. So I thought it was an appropriate title. The promise is enormous. We've got data science, artificial intelligence. We've got a number of UW Medicine strategic goals we're trying to achieve, a subset of which clearly would benefit from better approaches to manipulating, analyzing, and applying what we learn from data. And this is part of the UW Medicine strategic goal, is the quadruple aim, but the quadruple aim is about enhancing patient care for the individual, both the quality of that care and the experience of that care. You can imagine how digital technologies and data analysis could help with this. Clearly, looking at a population perspective on health and intervening at that level, trying to improve the health of the population requires cutting edge computational tools. Reducing costs is something where, again, analytics, data science, artificial intelligence all have potential roles. And improving the work life of healthcare providers, that may be a little less obvious, but here too, if we can figure how to best and most optimally use our information technologies, that has, again, great promise. There are two caveats. One is very recent and one is near the beginning of when I got involved in this field. The recent one is a recent report from the National Academy of Medicine titled Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare, the Hope, the Hype, the Promise, and the Peril. One of our own faculty, Steve Finn, who's a member of the National Academy of Medicine and who led VA efforts in large-scale analytics and computing, was one of the co-authors of this study. The other caveat goes back to 1984 from M. Scott Blois, who said the thing that computers do is frequently done by them more rapidly than it is by brains. There's been an irresistible urge to apply computers to medicine, but considerably less of an urge to attempt to understand where and how they can best be used. And this is a theme that Sean will be revisiting in his talk, looking at where and how can we best use the incredible computing power that we now have and the incredible potential of these large-scale data resources. Next slide. So what Sean will be describing in more detail is our efforts to position UW to achieve this promise. The UW is a national leader in a number of key relevant domains. We are a top institution in terms of medical training, both in terms of quality and in terms of volume. We are a top institution in both primary care and specialty care on the clinical end. And we are one of the top tier research institutions in the world and in the country on a biomedical side. There are a lot of cognate disciplines relative to data science and artificial intelligence where we excel as well in alphabetical order here: biomedical informatics, bioethics, biostatistics, computer science, and engineering. As we move forward, one of the first things we felt necessary to do was to inventory what our assets were as we continue to look toward the future and planning for that future. A key point here is no one department, no one school can do this alone. Interdisciplinary collaborations are going to be absolutely vital. This is both within and outside UW Medicine, across the UW campus, potentially beyond with other partners. The participants in this initial planning effort, who will flash by on a slide later, again in alphabetical order, included anesthesia, bioethics, biomedical informatics, lab medicine, pathology, medicine, radiation oncology, radiology, UW Medicine Information Technology Services, our clinical computing core, and the people who maintain our data assets, UW Medicine Office of Research and Graduate Education, and a number of individual partners, but these were the large organizational units that were participating. So I'd like to thank everybody who participated from these units. We've put in place an interim governance for these planning activities. The executive sponsors are myself and Dr. Dushyant Sahani, the chair of radiology. The interim lead for these efforts is Sean Mooney. We've established an executive steering committee made up of members of these participating organizing groups, as well as a task force made up of members of those groups and beyond, to help us inventory what we have on the ground already and to begin to plan for future platforms to fill gaps in our systems and structures that we've identified, to establish new research programs, and to identify and help seek funding for new projects. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sean and just briefly introduce Sean. Sean came to us and was recruited after a long competitive national search to serve both as our Chief Research Information Officer for UW Medicine, overseeing and expanding our research computing infrastructure, supporting clinical and translational researchers in particular, leveraging the medical record to support our researchers and related work. He also is a professor in the Department of Biomedical Informatics and Medical Education, and as I noted, is serving as the lead of this effort right now. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sean.
Great, thank you, Peter. Really, really excited to be here and super happy to see all of you attending. This is going to be hopefully a fun presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the activities that I've been a part of that I think are really exciting in this space. And then I'll talk a little bit about the future later on in this toward the end. So first of all, you've all seen my emails. I hope they weren't too annoying. And I hope they weren't too annoying. We have a seminar series. This is the kickoff event. We are going to have 2 a month. The focus is going to be combining clinical leadership and clinical thought leaders with AI leaders to, AI and data science to kind of illustrate the current challenges and some of the work that's been going on in the field and what the state of the art is. And I think local leaders will, when they present, will be, maybe somewhat non-traditional and shorter, and that we'll have a lot of time for discussion. We may even do things that you wouldn't normally see in a seminar series, such as doing small breakouts or things like that to kind of talk about or reflect on the presentation that was just seen. In general, they'll happen on the first and third Mondays. There's some that have been rescheduled already due to holidays. So Zach Kahane from Harvard will present on December 14th, which I believe is the second Monday. And we've already scheduled Mia for the 15th, which I've been told is President's Day. So that's actually going to be rescheduled. But we're really excited that all of these folks are coming to attend and present to us. And I'm hoping you all be excited about attending all of these meetings. I do want to shout out some other opportunities. So as you register for the REDCap form, I promise to keep the emails very, very light and not send too many out. But I will include other presentations that are coming up. The departments, a number of departments have their own seminar series. And when they hit a topic that is of interest to this group, I will include that as a list. So for example, on the 21st, there's a talk by Dr. Anil Parwani that was in the bottom of my advertisement link. And I encourage all of you to attend that. I also want to mention that because of COVID-19 and the fact that a lot of conferences have moved virtual, I just want to remind everyone that this is an awesome opportunity to attend conferences that normally you may not attend, either for time reasons or for perhaps financial or resource reasons. And many of these conferences right now are free, and they are also online, and so that you can register for them and maybe expose yourself to some areas that you normally wouldn't attend. So for example, over the next few days, on October 21st, the Symposium on Artificial Intelligence for Learning Health Systems at SAIL.health is going to be virtual and free. Initially, this was scheduled to take place in the Bahamas. And because of COVID-19, they've moved it virtual. It's largely led out of the East Coast, but it looks like it's going to be a great meeting. And they have a number of thought leaders who are really focused on the kinds of challenges that we're going to be talking about today and in future meetings. Another meeting to be aware of that you may be familiar with is the Pacific Symposium on Biocomputing, or PSB. It's on Hawaii every year in the first week or two of January. It's actually a really nice meeting to attend, although it's not inexpensive. PSB will be completely virtual this year and free, and it has a number of sessions that overlap of interest to this group, including a workshop on establishing the reliability of algorithms in biomedical informatics that's being led out of Sage Bionetworks that's just down the street from us. So I'm going to start and talk a little bit about the history and computers as problem solvers. In 2007, checkers was solved completely by a computer, and the computer was able to enumerate essentially all possible future positions in a game and make a determination of what the best possibility was, and it essentially became a solved problem after that. In fact, solving checkers was good enough to be able to get a science paper, which I think is very interesting, and you can go back and read that science paper if you'd like. Similarly, we have grown up seeing news articles like every couple of years about more advances in algorithms that play chess, and how an algorithm beat some won some tournament or beat some grandmaster or others. And I just want to point out that that in 2009, a algorithm that was running on a mobile phone using 2009 technology won a competition of masters. And so I think, computers are getting faster and smaller, and we're starting to solve bigger and bigger problems. Similarly, in healthcare, we've seen an increase in use of electronic health record systems. You all are aware of this when you see when you go and visit a clinical site, have a patient encounter as a patient. We're all patients, at least some of the time. All of our data is entered into a computer system. And from the 1970s to 2000, there was considerable growth in those systems. And as those systems matured, data has begun to accumulate because we now have, essentially mature electronic medical record or health record systems at sites that have been accumulating data for perhaps decades. And today there's increasingly better data that's incorporated into EHRs that are available to us, such as social determinants of health data, environmental determinants of health, richer phenotypic data, patient-reported outcome data, quality of life data, all sorts of data sets that may be of interest to research. And we're starting to see researchers leverage that data more and more. But there's a challenge. I think one of the challenges that we've observed is that in an IOM report in 1999, To Err is Human, talked about raising the issue of medical errors and pronounced that a large number of patients each year die as the result of preventable medical errors. And Informatics had seen this before, but immediately saw the opportunity to prevent preventable errors in EHRs. However, there's a flip side to this and a balance in that every provider is aware of the concept of alert fatigue and over alerting or over badgering of a computer system because there's just an enormous number of false positives or alerts that are either obvious or known to the provider already. In fact, just as an example, there have been numerous studies on this, but just as an example from UCSF, a study in 2014 found that there were 187 audible alerts per bed per day. And obviously that's not sustainable or useful and making the provider's life easier. So to that end, I think all of us believe that AI and data science should improve the work of providers, including, reducing work in electronic health records, increasing time with patients, reducing burnout, improving patient outcomes, et cetera. You can probably come up with your own list of what to do. And I think in our view, I think data and AI are achieving that goal, but I think have fallen short of what we really want to achieve and what we could do in the future. And I think that really motivates us in terms of what we're going to talk about today. This has been predicted. We knew that data science was coming in the in AI. We knew in healthcare. We knew that AI in healthcare was coming, and we've known that for a long time. Many specialties have been developing computer systems that support, like, say, clinical decision support. There are now FDA-approved devices or algorithms. There's business analytics. There are tools for screening patient risk that are AI-driven, and many, many institutions have responded in really an impressive way. So for example, Stanford School of Medicine created a department of biomedical data science in their medical school. And Harvard created a biomedical informatics department within their medical school. And that was, I think, I'm not sure what the exact number was, but I think that was their first department in decades that was created. Here at the University of Washington, we've invested heavily in Peter Tarczy-Hornoch's department, Biomedical Informatics and Medical Education, and a number of new faculty have been recruited. And there are other departments as well who have also invested in recruiting faculty in this space. I really want to emphasize that we're no different here at UW and UW Medicine. We have had electronic health record systems in place for some time. We've accumulated data. We have 30 years of clinical data that are available in the enterprise data warehouse. Many of you leverage that for research. That includes extracted concepts from text. I'll talk more about that. Some social determinants of health that are extractable, environmental determinants of health. We are always increasing improved outcome data and mortality data that we integrate into that data set. There's some geocoded patient data for population health studies that some investigators are leveraging. And the integration of other advanced data sets like image, smart device, and genomes are possible or are coming, or there are investigators that are working on that. And although the EDW is largely used operationally, it's fully ready for use by research, and many of you who are on this call have used it for that. Again, we're also putting in place an enterprise EHR Epic, and we'll go, essentially all Epic all the time soon with a go live date early next year. And I think we're seeing a growing dedication to integrating research into the EHR, leveraging Epic. We'll have lots of conversations about that in the future. Epic also has machine learning models that they're providing that are essentially out of the box, and they're being evaluated by UW Medicine's operational analytics team and Beth Britt and Adam Wilcox. And then finally, we've just recently recruited a CMIO, Todd Burstein, who I look forward to working with in terms of leading an enterprise strategy around development and architecture about the future. And I can't stop there, and I need to mention that we all know, everybody who's on this seminar knows that the Seattle area is extremely rich in machine learning and research in AI from all aspects of that. And we have so many faculty and other research scientists in our ecosystem who are developing methods and other tools, who are ready to work with essentially a machine learning or AI ready health system. And I think that this gives us just really an amazing opportunity to be able to do something transformational. So what is our focus? So we really believe that we're kind of at the nexus of these three circles. We have method developers, we have healthcare delivery, and we have machine learning enabling platforms that are actually in medicine. And we'd really like, and I think our goal is to really kind of put us here, to put us at that intersection, to be able to really investigate the application of machine learning, the challenges around implementation and function, as well as the outcomes that patients have in terms of how we advance care through the use of data and data science. So we've had a group of chairs and executives who have been meeting over the past, almost the past year now, since February or March. And then there was a pre-group that was meeting that wrote a report early on. I just want to acknowledge them. And we meet every month and talk about high-level strategy, about kind of efforts that we might be able to do to improve this. Similarly, we've also convened a task force that meets that has been meeting every 2 weeks for the last 3 or 4 months. It consists of faculty, staff, postdoctoral and graduate trainees, and has really been meeting to kind of conceptualize what an initiative might look like, what the projects might be, if we were to build platforms that enable a vision, what can they do, what would those platforms look like, and what are the programmatic areas that we would want to drive through to make us most unique and competitive. The programs that were originally conceived of in the original report that was written by the chairs and executives late last year or early this year focused on 6 different programmatic areas: technology for innovations and discovery, advanced diagnostics, business and healthcare operations, care delivery transformation, societal impacts of AI, and educating the next generation AI-enabled workforce. As part of this process, we've been gathering an inventory of all the AI-related projects that are going on in the School of Medicine that were investigator-led. We've identified almost 100 projects at this point that are at various levels of maturity. Some of them are as big as single multi-million-dollar R01s, all the way down to individual projects that have, say, a rotation student working on, where they're trying to ask some very, relatively narrowly focused question. As part of COVID-19 and the kind of observational research that's going on there, we have more than 60 projects that have been identified and served. Many of you have been a part of that process, and some of which we're now starting to see publications on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then we also did kind of iterative straw polls to identify projects or project areas with the task force that we would like to know more about. And we're kind of in the process right now of like asking those questions of like, what will we know and what will we want to know? And we created a REDCap intake for School of Medicine investigators to register a project that they'd like to kind of add to this inventory or list. Just as a very high level, the projects that seem to come out of interest from the group are here on the screen, and really focused on all areas that we might imagine. There are projects in outpatient care, improvements in telehealth, projects around population health or screening for diseases and risks, inpatient emergency and acute care focused projects, projects surrounding equity, reducing healthcare disparities and access to the health system, and then finally, projects that were either system-wide or improved efficiency of the health system using AI and data science. So at the very least, one of the things that we've done is built kind of a very a nice overarching view of all of the work that's going on, down to kind of detailed level projects to these more high level projects. And I think we're starting to see where people are really interested in investing their time into. All right, so for the next section of my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that's been going on in investing. And you know, I think that we often, you know, you read papers and we often see methods that have been developed where data, you know, an IRB was developed, was approved, data was extracted probably through an honest broker from a health system. That data is then transformed, maybe harmonized and integrated with other data sets or with other health system data. A method is developed, you get some form of cross-validation or other form of validation is done, you get an ROC curve, et cetera, and then you get a paper that's published and we read that paper. We're starting to see increasing pressure to publish papers or do work that includes some sort of integration or implementation. We're seeing papers now where methods are being developed and they're actually being piloted within a health system or within a clinical site, and that work has been used to integrate into clinical workflows. And you know, in the future, it's tantalizing to think about how we may be able to implement and study outcomes from patients at various levels from the uses of data and data science, you know, at the point of care, both as part of clinical practice as well as part of an investigational study. Really, really intriguing and awesome area to think about. So let's talk a little bit about data and better data. You know, standards when it comes to data, and as we mature in kind of the research area around data, standards are absolutely key. And that includes standards for standard models for data, that includes standard models for metadata, and includes a standard nomenclature that enable us to talk in the same language, regardless of whether we're doing research at the University of Washington or at, say, Harvard in Boston. And the standard nomenclature, such as ontologies with agreed upon definitions of terms, are increasingly important for enabling research across multiple sites. Similarly, metadata, such like, you know, DICOM data in radiology or metadata created from genomics experiments, are extremely important. And you know, standards have been lacking in many types of data that we collect around metadata, and it really, and I think at the end of the day, doing better research will require, you know, better standards there. And then finally, electronic health record data is defined standard data models, such as the Odyssey's OMOP relational data model for EHR data, and there are others that enable integration of data sets across multiple sites. So as an example, we just published a paper with the National Kidney Precision Medicine Project. Jonathan Himmelfarb at UW is one of the PIs, is the contact PI for the central coordinating hub for the KPMP. And if you'd like to learn more about kind of what we're thinking about in terms of use of ontologies for both discovery and implementation, you can read the paper that was published in Nature Reviews Nephrology about how open biomedical ontologies give a very common language for describing human disease phenotypes, you know, medication exposures, and molecular things like cell types, molecular functions, et cetera. And that will help us build a platform to bring that, bring that all together. There are a number of folks that are in our ecosystem that are helping kind of make this, make our data better. Adam Wilcox and Beth Britt. Adam is a faculty member and chief analytics officer of UW Medicine. Beth is the director of analytics in ITS and maintains the EDW, and have built a draft common data model data set that is being leveraged for a number of different research studies, including the National N3C initiative. Steve Mooney, no relation, is a faculty member in epidemiology and is leading the effort to geocode all UW Medicine patients for research, and has a number of projects where he's been helping in that space. And Mili Hayet again, also in BIME, has been annotating clinical narrative text and extracting data from notes such as social determinants of health and other computable phenotypes, and is an awesome collaborator and has been doing enormous amount of work to try to make unstructured data computable and usable in research studies. I've collaborated for the last couple of years with Christina Bandera-Goda. We just had a graduate student, Jim Fong, who we co-mentored together, who has been working on annotating environmental determinants of health from EHR data. And then quickly, Nick Dobbins in Research IT built Leaf, which many of you use as a self-service tool for access. He's also a graduate student working with Miliha and building really cool tools to access unstructured data. And then finally, Andrea Hartzler and many others has started to have conversations about better capture of outcomes and patient-reported outcome measures and social determinants of health with the health system for the focus of research. So again, this is really an area that we're really excited about helping make enterprise data better for investigation and better for data science. And again, there's also lots of effort in the cloud to make the cloud more clinically research friendly as well. So as an example, Miliha and Nick and others have developed a pipeline for bulk processing of unstructured data. And that includes clinical narrative notes and reports. They've applied this algorithm to the enterprise data warehouse. And just getting this algorithm to run quickly was a significant effort. They can process about 13,000 sentences per hour and about a month's worth of notes per week. We have more than 100 million pieces of text in the EDW, and they've processed about 85 million notes from 2014 to 2019. That's available for you if you'd like to do research on that. We can extract it and deliver it. And we have more than 2 billion extracted results from the Unified Medical Language System concepts. And so this is a sort of an example of the sorts of data that we can make available to investigators to do better research. Similarly, Chathan, a graduate student in my group who works very closely with Patrick Hegarty, Jerry Jarvik, and others, has been looking at clinical text in radiology reports for extracting lumbar-related findings in radiology. He's built a number of methods for doing that different extraction and compared them. And what you're looking at here is each box plot is a box plot of the accuracy of different findings from an individual health system using the appropriate method that's on the y-axis. And the only point out of the data isn't really what I wanted to point out here. Is one of the things that I wanted to point out is that the best methods are not always the most transferable methods, and the most transferable methods are not the best methods. And I think that's something really important to understand, is that if you build a good transferable method, you may be able to build a better method that's derived toward the data from that specific site or vice versa. And it's really an open question, and assessment becomes really important. Another area that's also of strong interest in the field right now, and many of you have either been exposed to this, and there are a number of investigators that are actually working on this, is the idea of synthetic people. And I just took this off of a website that I just find fascinating. And if you go to the URL, thispersondoesnotexist.com, they will present you a synthetic image of an individual who does not exist, that was developed using a generative adversarial network approach. And And the photos that are from this site are absolutely amazingly impressive. None of these people actually exist, and they are essentially synthetic faces. We've had similar efforts in our field to develop synthetic databases of patients, and it's not as pretty or as striking as like an image of a person who does not exist. You could imagine developing a relational database that looks like electronic health record data for patients who are synthetic. And there are a number of there's a ton of value to those data sets. If you populate, say, an OMOP data set, synthetic data can easily enable exploration for trainees without having to worry about HIPAA. You can learn about the data, and it can provide, essentially technical validation of analytics without the use of real patient data. That is, does your algorithm work on the database you're looking for it to work on without actually having it work on real patient data? It also provides, basic analytics that can inform you about a health system's data, like such as their data dictionary, in terms of what terms or maps they use, what terms or what features or variables that they have available to you. It can talk a little bit about variable distributions and other population level features, depending on how hard how rigorous that data set can be made. And there are even individuals out there that are speculating, or at least trying to show that you can train machine learning models on synthetic data that could actually be applied to real populations or real health systems. I think that's I put a little asterisk there because I think that's a really intriguing idea. It seems to me that to do this perfectly, you'd have to have a perfect model of a human and all of the risks that would go into, having them encounter a health system. But that's that's a really interesting, intriguing idea. And when the GAN develops those faces I showed you on the previous slide, if one of the individuals has, like, say, a mole on their face, how that mole got there isn't really deeply thought of in a biological way by the algorithm, but yet it's there, and it's there in a way that is like a human would be. So anyway, I think this is a really fascinating area. There's a ton of research. We have a graduate student who's working with Sage Bionetworks, Yao Yan, who's in biomolecular engineering, who's been developing synthetic data sets. And I think this is going to be an area of a lot of interest in the future. All right, so that's all I'm going to talk about data. And now I'm going to move and talk a little bit about methods, but I'm not going to talk about methods very much. I mentioned before that in our ecosystem, there are numerous investigators. I would argue that there are hundreds or perhaps even thousands of investigators, if we include trainees, who are building methods that are relevant to this space. And these methods, often will develop some form of a receiver operator characteristics curve or some other metric for measuring, how accurate that approach is, or that method is. So I'm not going to talk too much about this. I will give an example from my world in clinical genetics, or medical genetics, or human genetics, I should say. And I really see in the genetics world, I think this is a great example of where we're headed. We have, kind of this trilogy of data. We have experimental data from, like, say, deep mutational scans or high throughput biotech assays, where we can apply, where we can, interrogate a single variant or all the possible variants in a gene in a high throughput way to identify whether that variant is likely to be deleterious or not. We can also, my group has been building machine learning methods to predict whether a genetic variant is likely to be pathogenic or not, using a supervised way where we have a database of a lot of variants that cause disease or are likely causing disease, and a lot of variants that we think are likely benign. And we can ask the question, what are the features that make a variant look like it's pathogenic or not? And then finally, the clinical geneticist will apply guidelines and will maybe stretch and look at these other types of data, like the machine learning, the biotech data, and the clinical knowledge of a variant, to make a prediction about whether whether that variant is pathogenic or not. But I think it's really important that to think about, at the end of the day, these three different these three different circles are all giving kind of different views on something that's very similar, and that is a variant pathogenic and causing a clinical phenotype in a person? And they're all complementary, and they're all, they're all right in their own ways, and they may all be wrong in their own ways. And I really think that data science will help kind of build a convergence to understanding why they're different from each other, based on the limitations of the data that was presented to each, or the approach that was presented to drive that annotation. Another thing I want to mention about methods too is that we always look at ROC curves and areas under the curve of methods, and I think we in general tend to overestimate how accurate they might really be in the real world. And again, this is an example from my work, and I'm showing a machine learning method ROC curve that looking at the blue curve that's on the left for our method MutePred2 that we assessed. And on the right-hand side, this is the actual values that went into developing that ROC curve of an AUC of 0.845. And before I saw this, I always thought a ROC curve of 0.845, well, that's pretty good. It should look really good. And then we looked at this. This doesn't look as good as the ROC curve does. And so I think, that's another area too, is that the individual predictions in terms of precision and recall may not be as good as we think they are from just the view of a PR curve or of a ROC curve. I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about something that I really, really love, and that's unbiased assessment. And how do we assess methods in an accurate way? Almost all methods that are published in literature suffer from something that I think Sage Bionetworks was the ones that came up with this idea of a self-assessment bias. That is, every investigator that publishes a paper, that develops a method or applies a method, kind of assesses themselves. They do some sort of cross-validation or something else, and the peer reviewers get on their case about it, get on their case about it, and they revise it. But at the end of the day, it's really the writer, the author of the paper, that's doing that assessment. And I think that it's really critical, particularly when we start thinking about implementation and operational uses of AI, that they should be assessed independently. And one of the ways that do this that I'm a huge fan of, and it's been a major effort of my group, has been these so-called citizen science approaches to evaluation, where essentially community challenges or bake-offs are done, where we ask a community to develop methods that solve a certain problem, and that we have essentially answers to a solution that aren't widely available to the developers. And then the developers give either the answers or give the method, and we then have an independent assessment of how well each of those different methods do. The critical assessment, so I know that, for example, David Baker's group here and others have been really invested in the critical assessment of structure prediction for decades now. I actually think that was one of the first community challenges that addressed the self-assessment bias, because in the late 80s, early 90s, a lot of people were publishing structure prediction algorithms without actually with an assessment, and they weren't really assessed equally, and it was hard to tell which methods worked the best. Sage Bionetworks has been organizers of the DREAM challenges, which are a consortium to actually build these sorts of unbiased challenges. There's some commercial ones too, like Kaggle has a web portal that does this. And there are others that allow, essentially for development of new methods along with this unbiased assessment. And the method, and the underlying method accuracy is not assessed by the investigators. Again, my group has been involved with a DREAM challenge. We've been an assessor for CASP as well. We're a co-organizer of the critical assessment of functional annotation, which is a worldwide effort to look at annotation of genomic or proteomic data with function annotations. And I'm an advisor and a predictor and assessor for the critical assessment of genome interpretation as well. This is an area that's very close to me, and I think it's really great for getting papers and doing new methods. And getting new methods published quickly that have a high impact. So about a year ago, we brought together a couple of groups to start talking about, things that we could do in data and data science that would be really exciting. And here's a list of the ones that the people that I've talked to probably the most about this, in terms of what we may be able to, what we may be able to achieve around assessing methods in healthcare at UW-Medicine. And what I'm going to talk about over the next 10 or 15 slides, none of this hasn't been published yet, so we're just getting ready to submit the paper. We've submitted a pilot paper that was just published in JAMIA if you want to read more about that. But it's an area that we're really interested in exploring more, and we can talk about it. And we developed what I would think of as an ambitious experiment, leveraging synthetic electronic health record data. So we talked about synthetic data earlier. We basically took a synthetic data set that was in the OMOP data model and hosted it in an AWS cloud environment. And this was working again with Sage. They've been a collaborator now for a long time. And Justin Prosser in Research IT at UW-Medicine, and Tim and Yao, who are both graduate students who are getting, Tim is getting ready to graduate, excuse me, and is on this call and helping facilitate this seminar. And leveraging Sage's Synapse platform, we essentially built what I'm kind of likening to an honest broker of machine learning models, where an investigator could then build a model in a relatively automated way, submit it to Synapse, and then apply it to the synthetic data so that for the purposes of technical validation that the model works. And then what we did behind the scenes was we built a mechanism to take those models and apply them to EHR data that have been stripped of identifiers that were in UW-Medicine. And that was basically us taking those models out and taking those models out of that cloud and applying them to our data on-prem to assess how well that model worked. And then what we did was we have provided, if it was a data scientist, we provided the accuracy back to the data scientist. In more detail, I know this is complicated, but this is the map of what I just described. In more detail, the researchers up in the upper left-hand corner, Sage's Synapse platform, which collects the models and collects the results of models, is in the bottom left-hand corner. Working with the NIH, we architected models that where the synthetic data was, so that the models could be applied to synthetic data, again, for the purposes of technical validation, but not training and not evaluation of the actual model. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, that's the UW-Medicine platform with the data that has been stripped of identifiers that we could take those models and apply them. Only the results of the models were then returned to the investigators through the Synapse platform. So the investigators never had access to any of the data that we did. So we had a number of rules that we developed. I've alluded to some of them. The data scientists never had access to UW-Medicine data. The models never had access to patient identifiers. The models never had access to the internet at either. And we controlled all the systems and data in UW that the models could be applied, and only the broad accuracy was returned to the data scientist. And the data scientists, to prevent overfitting, also to prevent others, maybe nefarious activity, we limited them to a very small number of models that they could submit. This was in partnership with NIH and again, and Sage, as I mentioned, to enable this. And we started to talk about a number of experiments. We've run 3 of these so far, and I'm going to talk about each of those 3 now. And we developed an ambitious experiment. Google and Stanford and UCSF had recently published a paper in 2018 where they predicted patient mortality. They predicted the risk. They also identified risk factors and published an ROC curve AUC of 0.93 and 0.94. And we thought this would be a great use case because mortality is a very quantitative phenotype. It's easy to describe, and we felt we had good data there, and we had a recent OMOP data set that we could leverage. So we announced a dream challenge around this that used this model to data approach, where instead of sharing data with investigators, investigators would share models with us, and then we would choose to apply them. And so we identified a data set of about just under 1.2 million patients that was used for training, and another data set of about 35,000 patients that was used for the validation phase that was done. And this was in collaboration with the National Center for Data to Health, as well as the Institute for Translational Health Sciences. And so we then developed a timeline. I'm not going to talk about that because I don't have time. And had a number of phases that would enable, essentially onboarding and doing the work with different folks. And we then invited data scientists to start building models against that synthetic data in the cloud. And data science is definitely showed up. To date, we've had almost 400 participate in this first study. About 20 teams were able to validate models against the synthetic data in a way that we would want to apply. And I can show you some of the results that we've seen for those 20 models. First of all, the ROC curves are quite good. I don't think I put the number here, but they exceeded the Google, Stanford, UCSF papers, ROC, AUC. In fact, that team participated in this as well, and I think was in the top 5, but was not the top method. And the best methods in terms of precision and recall were quite good, with about 0.5 precision or positive predictive value and about 0.5 of recall or sensitivity, which I think is really impressive. One of the things that I want to mention is that even though the algorithms, the best algorithms did quite well, they varied considerably amongst each other in terms of race, and by race of the patient being predicted on. And I think this is something that, as we start thinking about being an equitable health system, this is an area that I think is really important for AI, that both as a solution to and potentially a cause of. And I think in this time and all of that we've gone through over the last 6 months, I think it's really important that as we think about machine learning, we think about how machine learning operates and works on all the populations that are that are patients at UW Medicine. We also announced a COVID-19 challenge. So we had a little bit different rules. We formulated a number of questions: risk of a positive test result, risk of hospitalization, risk of being put into the ICU, risk of intubation, and risk of death. 2 of them are live and have been going for a number of weeks now. Yao Yan and a number of others have been participating in managing and developing this. And I just want to share a couple of interesting results that have come out of this. So we've had thousands of submissions for over the 6. This is a couple weeks old, but over the 16 or so weeks from this up to this point that have been submitted here. And I want to show the results in that we've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different data sets that have been released over time. And the initial results, what we're looking at here are box plots of the ROC curve of the different models. The x-axis is the weeks, so time goes to the right, and the colors on the box plots of the different data sets as they're released. So each data set has more data attached to it. What we see is an improvement of the models over time. We do have some suggestion that there's overfitting, because when we switch out one data set for another, we see a decrease in accuracy that then quickly improves back up again. And so that's something that, we really, our goal is to be an unbiased assessor. We don't want to actually be the cause of overfitting. So that's something that's important to us. And so I think that's really interesting to watch these models evolve over time. But in general, they're getting more accurate. They started with an ROC curve AUC of about 0.5. We initially didn't allow training. We do now because we felt we had enough data, but the ROC curves have gone up to having an area under the curve of 0.7 or even higher. For hospitalization, I don't think we have enough data yet. We've been doing this for 5 weeks or so, and I think it's been, in terms of the accuracy, it's been pretty flat. We also see some evidence of overfitting here, and that's something that we're looking at approaches to control for, because I think that's really an important area that we should think about. So here's some quick lessons learned. One, I think the idea that electronic health record data is unuseful for prediction is really a myth at this point. I think the data is really quite rich, and it's something that we can use. I think it still has a number of quality issues, and there's a lot of missing data, and there's a lot of really interesting areas that we need to address. But I just think that this data is starting to mature enough to be actually useful. We applied a non-data sharing approach to this, and so I think data sharing is not always required to develop accurate methods. And I think that's also really important, because usually we want to get access to the data, but I think, using synthetic data that is derived from a data set and using cloud-like architectures for moving models around, using containerized models is a good approach for developing accurate methods. And I think you'll see more and more of that as you get data sets that are protected by law, such as HIPAA or FERPA or whatever the privacy regulation is. And importantly, we believe that machine learning algorithms can perform differently on different subgroups like demographics, race, gender, age, how many times you've spent with a health system, even if they are solving the same problem, trained on the same data, and are similarly accurate on the population. And I think that's something that we all kind of need to think about a lot as we implement AI in healthcare, in that each method, even though it has similar accuracy, may be quite different underneath the hood. And I think even with a rigorous multi-team independent assessment, I do want to say that I think overfitting of models is possible, and we do see that, and it's something we really need to think carefully about, because a lot of models out there are overfit when they end up in a publication because of self-assessments, and I think independent assessments will help address that, and so I think that's something that we should think about. All right, so I'm gonna run out of time here, so I want to make sure I get through everything. I know it's almost 2. We're scheduled to go till 2:30, so I'll go for a few more minutes. And I think one of the things that I want to just mention, this is work by Noah Hammerlund, who is who started this seminar and is facilitating today. And that is, as we think about access and equity of all populations to UW Medicine, machine learning can actually play a positive role, and potentially a cause of healthcare disparities. And his group, what Noah's been doing as part of his work, has been looking at looking at how disadvantaged groups are less likely to receive resource-intensive treatments, and he uses machine learning and clinical data to understand the drivers behind these disparities, and then uses machine learning to decompose the difference between health and healthcare disparities. So for example, in the figure on the right, if one group, if a person comes in to a person comes in and is diagnosed with, like, say, cardiac issues and has surgery, and you have 2 groups, like, say, based on race, like, say, Black or white patients, you can identify a difference, and some of those differences are actual health disparities, and some of those differences are due to health care. And what and so, as I mentioned, so he is identifying policies or target policies that can better address disparities, like health risk disparities that include society-wide policies to reduce inequities in health burden, and healthcare disparities are things that a health system could do or at the health system or provider level, to increase equitable treatment, and then monitor the fair allocation of innovative and resource-intensive technologies, and apply. At the end of the day, he's done a really clever approach, which he builds machine learning algorithms to predict whether a patient is going to, say, get surgery, like in the case I said before, and he trains it on one group, like, say, by race. So he'll train all of the white patients with a model to predict surgery outcome, and train all of the Black patients. And then he will actually apply the models to, like, say, what would happen if a white patient was treated like a Black patient, and vice versa, or whatever the group is. Could be based on gender, could be based on other things, to identify the difference between health disparities and these healthcare disparities. And he's done this. He's got publications on this, and working with data from Indiana University Health and the Regan Streif Institute, where he's used this to actually estimate and decompose, the health disparities versus healthcare disparities. So I think this is a really interesting and intriguing area that we should invest in and and work with as we kind of go down this journey in AI and data science. All right, so I'm getting ready to finish up here, so I don't go too long. And I do want to say a couple of things about implementation and integration into clinical workflows. It's really a set of Legos or Tetris pieces that are in 3D that you all have to assemble in a way that is, I think, underappreciated in terms of how complex it is to get a health system that has potentially tens of thousands of employees and, tens or hundreds, or even thousands of clinical sites, to think in terms of the functional change that occurs with the integration of fancy analytics or data in processes. And so I think, this is a slide from Dushyant Sahani, developed very early on in our conversation from radiology about, about how AI can be developed to enable advanced diagnostics and support, the AI portions of digital health and the use of data. And one of the things that we're really driving through, this is another slide from Dushyant, is development of platforms for AI in medicine, about how can we actually technically enable that data generation, the data annotation, and the model construction that can then be deployed in specific studies and then studied, when that deployment happens in a way that is, IRB happy, health system happy, and, regulatory, like FDA happy. And I think all of that is a real challenging question that we're all going to, hopefully think about increasingly over the future. There's tons of papers out there that are starting to talk about this, that are really starting to think intellectually about not just the building of models, but how do we actually integrate those models into specific clinical workflows. I'm not going to talk about this too much now, but this is something that I think as we develop a platform for AI, that this is really an area that we need to think about carefully. I know that there are other health systems out there. Maybe I won't name names, but there are other health systems out there who have deployed AI-based approaches and have quickly turned them off again after they turn them on, and have started to think more carefully about governance after they were turned on. I'm going to finish too with a thought experiment. I don't mean this to be negative, but I think it's also something that we should think about. Every year, there's just over 36,000 people who are killed in an auto accident, which is really a horrible number. Fortunately, it's gone down over the last few years. But I want to mention that AI-driven cars are disproportionately in the news. You've all seen stories about the application of AI in, like, say, a Tesla. And if there's one Tesla accident that happens while that thing was on, its little autopilot mode, that generally tends to make the news. And even if it wasn't the Tesla's fault, it still makes the news repeatedly. And you compare that to the overall rate of death in automobile accidents. It's really an interesting societal phenomenon that I think I don't totally understand, but I think we need to think about it carefully. And I think this also maps back to AI in healthcare as well. Scientific American did an article just before COVID days about how AI was rushing into patient care and could raise risks. And I think this is, an area that, I think this is why we're here, and what we are should be, investing and thinking about. So there are a number of challenges we need to understand. I think, the patient perspective, and how do patients feel about the use of data and AI in healthcare, provider perspectives and making their lives easier, as I mentioned toward the beginning of my talk. What does successful governance look like? And what does it look like elsewhere? I think there's a ton of area for research and for scholarly work or writing papers in this space, because I just think that it's an area that a lot of people are thinking about. And then what are those technology platforms that are standardized so that we can move models around from different sites to evaluate them? Because we have oodles of data at this point, not just the data I showed you, that suggests that transferable models aren't necessarily the most accurate, and vice versa. And then there's this whole box of regulatory considerations about when does something become a device, and when and what you need to understand from an FDA or other an IRB or other regulatory perspectives. Just think is really, really critical. So I'm going to come back to the programmatic areas and that we've identified, and I think there's lots that we can do to invest into facilitating innovation in these areas. And we're really hoping that that everybody on this call will help engage in some way, and really appreciate everyone attending today. So just want to remind everyone, so thank you. I hope this presentation was interesting and exciting. We really have a number of luminaries, both from UW and outside of UW, who are going to put my presentation to shame. Who are going to tell us all about what they've been doing that are really, really exciting. And I'm hoping that all of you will come back and attend and discuss with them. And also, if you want to learn more, don't forget to register for SAIL or PSB, because I think it's a great opportunity to see what other sites are doing. And I think the more we know about what other sites are doing, the better we'll be able to do what we're going to do. So I'll finish there, and I think we have time for chat questions, or if you raise your hand, I think we can unmute you.
Yeah, Sean, there's 2 chat questions if you want to go through those.
I can't see them because I'm full screen, so someone will have to read them.
Okay, I can read them. Okay, so as our respective fields evolve, so this is from Lawrence True. As our respective fields evolve, new categories of disease are found. How can standardized nomenclature incorporate the new categories, and how is the value of former categories, which probably included several new categories, retained?
That's a great question. That's something that we've discussed at length as part of a couple of different consortia that are developing nomenclature, because if you start with the let's say you've got one, let's say you have some condition that you really suspect is multiple conditions, and that would probably be better characterized either molecularly or through, like, say, a clinical exam or whatever, to be multiple conditions. And so the question is, how do you get to the point where you're mature enough to add that to the nomenclature and to build definitions for that? And I think the process is going to be a long one. I think it's probably going to be similar to like what we saw with microarrays and breast cancer and the early microarray experiments that came out of Stanford, where there was an acknowledgement that there were microarray or gene expression markers for different types of cancer that could lead to better response to drugs or to differential response to different treatments. And I think you're going to see similar approaches like that as we start to build a nomenclature for different conditions. And I think really it takes a ton of research, both in all of the different disciplines that are contributing to this. But I think it really starts with an understanding of what those conditions are, and then the development of the nomenclature comes later. And some of the nomenclatures that we use clinically, like say ICD, do a terrible job at certain types of conditions, like rare genetic conditions, for example, are still horribly coded with ICD. Yet ICD has other codes that are almost humorous, like someone getting hit by a satellite or an astronaut getting injured in a space accident or something. So I think that we have, even for the terminologies that we use in the real world today, there's a lot of gaps that could be addressed.
Cool. Then the next one is from Samantha. Is there going to be a talk about how AI can be successfully integrated into EHRs in any of the upcoming, or are we trying to target a speaker for that specific topic?
I think all of the speakers will touch on that, particularly the external speakers. But actually, no, I take it back. The internal speakers as well will all touch on different solutions for this. Some are very exotic and some are less exotic. Some are, using products that are developed by the vendor, the EHR vendor, and they're just opened and applied. And others are, academic scholarly work that took an enormous amount of research investment.
Well, next question is from William Harefield. How does a research group or team achieve unbiased self-assessment and then solicit independent assessment and then share the differences between the two assessments with relevant parties? So I think he's trying to ask, how would you go about assessing your own model and then getting independent assessment and then showing that there are no differences or differences? Is there? Yeah,
this is just sort of my opinion on this. And I don't know if it's, I don't know how much weight it has. I think I'm super skeptical of publications that apply, that publish accuracies for new methods. That's just sort of my own bias based on years of doing these critical assessments, because the groups that do well are hard to predict going in, and so I tend to be I tend to be somewhat skeptical. I think that's sort of the process of research, right? Like we always read papers that we kind of like look at and say, I wonder about that. And I think everybody that's on this call has probably experienced that feeling. And I think that as you think about implementation, like let's say someone publishes a paper of a really exciting new method that they want to implement it, like say UW Medicine or let's say UCSF implements a method that they want to that they've just gotten funding to collaborate with UW on, and they want to implement it here. I think that's when it becomes really key to understand the performance of that method, as robustly or as rigorously as we possibly can. And I think that's going to, again, research doesn't oversee that. We, maybe a voice that contributes to that, but that's a, an analytics question, a governance question, a clinical question. There's so mmany different voices, and I think it's going to be quite multidisciplinary as we move into the future, but thinking about that. But I think I do worry I worry a lot about health systems doing self-assessment of methods. I think that's that makes me nervous, and I don't totally have a solution for that. We've kind of demonstrated this with the dream challenges, but I think it's just something that's going to be really exciting and interesting to think about in the future.
Well, and then we just had a question coming from Nicholas Ianu. I'm sorry if I butchered your last name. How do you eliminate the black box nature of most machine learning models? Is it important to do this?
It depends on the model, right? Like deep learning approaches that are auto-coding features, are notoriously uninterpretable. And one of the projects that we have one of the projects at UW that's being led by a faculty member in Biomedical, Gong Luo, who actually might be on this call, is developing, essentially clinical explanations for these really esoteric deep learning-like models. There are other approaches too that are more kind of traditional feature engineering, feature-based. Like if you build and engineer your own features, sometimes those features that you build can be the explanation themselves. So like in the genetics world, when we build machine learning algorithms that predict pathogenic genetic variants, the features we use are actually modeled after biology. And we've developed and published literature where we actually provide an explanation about what molecular feature, what biology is being disrupted to cause that phenotype or disease. And so I think it's multifold. I think one is you're going to need approaches for the very accurate and fancy but esoteric deep learning methods where the underlying cause of a prediction is really unclear, and approaches like what Gong is doing with auto explanations. But then I think if you're using more traditional feature, where you're engineering your own features, you can actually, there are a number of approaches that have been described in literature that can make accurate methods. That can make explainable methods that tell you what the underlying cause is.
So that's the end of the questions, unless anyone wants to throw a last minute one in there. So that's all we got.
Great. I really appreciate everybody coming and giving us an hour and a half. I see that a vast majority of you stayed till the end. I hope you're excited about this. If you have feedback, send them to me, Peter, or Dushyant. We'd love your feedback. If you have people you'd like to nominate for the seminar series, the same thing. Send us an email. We have a committee that's organizing the seminar series that includes faculty and trainees. You'll see the trainees will be facilitating the future seminars the way that Noah and Tim did today, and we thank them for that. I think it's a good experience as part of their training, and really looking forward to these future events. So thank you everyone very much for attending, and I'm looking forward to our next event, which is coming up on November 2nd. It's going to be radiology will presenting, Dushyant Sahani, the chair, and Christoph Lee. They'll talk a little bit about their work, and we will integrate discussion as part of that effort. So thank you very, very much.